Welcome to EconRoots, your podcast on the roots of economic thought. I'm Stefan.
And I'm Otto.
Let's get on with today's conversation. Good day, everybody. You're listening once again to EconRoots, your podcast on the history of economic thought. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are continuing our long but never tedious journey through the Nobel laureates. My name is, as always, Stefan, and as always with me today, I'm honored to be joined by
Otto.
Thank you. Are you good, Otto?
I'm fine.
That's good.
How about you?
I am also fine. So today we're going to tackle a very classical and important element of economic analysis, and that is general and partial equilibrium. And the stars of today is Kenneth Arrow, we have Joseph Stigler, and Gérard Debreu. And then we might talk a little bit about some others as well, but we'll see about that. So I think we should just very briefly define what an equilibrium is, Otto, and then we'll talk a little bit about Arrow.
Yeah. An equilibrium is a state where, given the actions of others, no individual has an incentive to change his or her action as well. So in a market, when we're going to talk a lot about markets today. An equilibrium would be where there is some supply equals demand, and nobody has an incentive to change neither the demand nor the supply.
So what some people also call a perfect competition model, right?
It would underlie a lot about what we're talking about today, but not necessarily.
All right, let's get back to that.
We have equilibria in markets with where there's imperfect competition.
Oh, interesting. We'll get to that. So we'll start with our first star of today's show. That is Kenneth Joseph Arrow. He was born on the 23rd of August, 1921. He died on the 21st of February, 2017, so relatively recently. He was an American, as most people are on this show. He started out as a mathematician. He was a writer and a political theorist. He was also known as a bit of a polymath. So just to tease for an upcoming bonus episode where we're actually interviewing the Nobel laureate Eric Maskin, which is going to be out in a couple of weeks, he relates a story with Arrow where they would find esoteric topics and research them and see if they could caught him off guard. And apparently at one time they decided to study up on the breeding habits of gray whales. And they all read a book, Maskin and the other students. And apparently Arrow had already read about that and believed that some of the conclusions of that was disputed by later research. I love that. He might have been faking it, who knows, but whatever. So he got the Nobel Prize with John Hicks in 1972 for their, and I quote, pioneering contributions to general economic equilibrium theory and welfare theory. So we might also touch a little bit about that. He was a neoclassical. He was a big believer in social choice theory, which he especially promoted in his monograph PhD dissertation, Social Choice and Individual Values. Good title on that. He actually wanted to be a math teacher, and when you read his lecture, his Nobel lecture, it is a great history of the rise of mathematics and economics. So a great source for that if people are interested. He was born by Romanian Jews. He was originally defined himself as a socialist, never a communist, but a socialist. He later distanced himself from socialism, but he remained sort of left-leaning, at least according to himself. He started by studying math at City College and then at Columbia, where he changed to economics due to influence by Harold Hotelling, which some of our listeners might know, and famous economist as well. So he actually wanted to be a high school teacher. That was his ambition, when he ended up winning the Nobel Prize and being one of the most influential economists. besides a brief stint in the United States Air Force as a weather officer during World War II, his career spans Chicago, Stanford, Harvard, the Rand Corporation, the Coles Committee, and he's also been on the Council of Economic Advisors and lots of other places. He was a founding editor of the Annual Review of Economics, and I could go on and on and on. Two last thing I will mention before we get into why he got the prize is that this is he's a focal point for a lot of other economists, also personally, in that he was the brother to Anita Summers. He was the uncle. Arrow was a brother to the economist Anita Summers, uncle to the economist and former Treasury Secretary and Harvard President Larry Summers. He's brother-in-law to Robert Summers and Paul Samuelson, and he married an economist, Selma Switzer, who he had 2 children with, who both became actors. And 5 of his former students have gone on to win the Nobel Prize. John Hassani, Eric Maskin, Roger Murison, Michael Spence, and Stiglitz. So it's an impressive background. So why did he get the prize?
Well, he proved together with or simultaneously with Debreu. We're going to discuss him in a moment, but he proved something very important in economics, namely the existence of a general equilibrium, and also laid the foundation for some very important results, theorems as we call them, about a general equilibrium. To understand what a general equilibrium is, we perhaps should start out with a single market.
Oh yeah,
or what we call a partial equilibrium. That was discussed already by Adam Smith, who realized that prices would have the function of balancing supply and demand. So basically, if there was more supply than demand, the price would fall. That would reduce the supply, and that would increase demand. So, for supply and demand to on a single market to balance, the price would play the important role. But what about if you take all the markets in the economy together?
Yeah, exactly. Because what Adam Smith talked about would be like the market for breath isolated, or the market for
we would look at a single market,
tin or laces or something like that.
Yes. He did have the intuition. That's already in Smith. The intuition that if the price worked to create equilibrium in each market, then there would be sort of equilibrium in the overall economy. But of course, the markets are linked. So the question is, if markets are linked, does a unique equilibrium or more equilibria, do they exist? And Smith wasn't able to prove this. A later economist, French economist, Léon Walras, took this discussion a step further, 100 years later than Smith, and he was also providing a quite intuitively interesting result. He was sort of having the idea that to say how could we balance all markets, and he proposed an idea. This was not. It was not supposed to be a description of how markets work, but he proposed, what if we had an auctioneer who sort of had, instead of a standard auction, would have the task of balancing all markets, and he could propose prices and see what would happen to supply and demand. And And Valrast's idea was that at some point you would find prices on each market that would balance supply and demand, so we would get a general equilibrium on all markets. But does such an equilibrium really exist? And he wasn't able to prove that. Arrow and Debreu were the first to do so, and they used modern math. As you pointed out, Arrow was a mathematician, and he used modern set theory to prove that actually under certain conditions you have an equilibrium will exist in spanning all markets. So that he finally proved what Adam Smith really had only had an intuition about.
And if I can add something, this is an extremely important proof, because it underlines a fundamental insight of economics, is that resources are scarce. So ultimately, resources are in competition with each other. So this should be the case, what he proved, right? But actually getting to that is an extremely important milestone in economic research.
Yeah, and you might have the situation that as if markets interact with one another, that might introduce some kind of instability.
Oh yeah,
that would never reach an equilibrium. But what they proved was that such an equilibrium, in fact, does exist.
Yeah.
So they don't really discuss how it comes about.
No,
and they don't have a mechanism really to show how the equilibrium is reached. But they show that it must exist.
Yeah, and here, for instance, Austrians or more dynamic people, dynamic-oriented economists would argue that's because we are both at the same time going towards and away from equilibrium all the time, because prices are constantly being renegotiated with the price mechanism and so on, right? But that doesn't take away from the theoretical accomplishment here of actually proving that. That's just, that's how the real world works, because it would work. It's not like we stop the world at one point and say, no, now we're there, right? But in theory, that could happen, yeah.
And of course, we should also remember the underlying assumption. The underlying assumption is that we have so-called perfect competition.
Oh yeah,
meaning that we have nobody on the demand side nor the supply side are able to influence the market. So all are, so to speak, price takers.
Yeah.
They take the price as given, not as something they can change, and that of course raises the question: who are changing prices?
Exactly.
How does that work? And that maybe when we're talking about partial equilibrium, that we have a better explanation how prices are set. But the assumption of perfect competition also includes that there are no information gaps, that are markets for everything, especially forward markets going forward in time. So we assume that there are markets for everything. We assume that all agents are instrumentally rational. Firms are profit maximizing. In that case, they showed not only that there would be an equilibrium, but there would be some very interesting properties to that equilibrium, and that led to the formulation of the two fundamental theorems of welfare theory, as we call it.
And before we get to those, I'll just like to add a little thing here. It's I have taught mainly at business school, as many people know, and I think there's a lot of value in teaching this stuff to everybody who studies economics, including business majors. But it is sort of a weird situation in the classroom if you actually get a bright student who says, but but am I not supposed to be the one who goes out and do this thing, right? And you sort of have to, yeah, you are, but now just take this for given now. But it's both a joyous teacher's moment because it shows that there's bright students in the classroom, but it's also sort of, you just have to go along with it. You have to argue it for a while, yeah. So let's talk about the welfare theorem. That's important. I've taught that a lot too, but yeah.
Well, the first theorem is that the general equilibrium will be Pareto efficient, meaning that it is not possible to change the welfare of anybody without or to increase the welfare of anybody without decreasing the welfare of somebody else. Yeah. So that's sort of the benchmark idea about welfare in economics. That's the Pareto criteria. If you can reach a state where we can't make somebody better off without making somebody worse off, then that state is efficient or optimal, we would call it. And assuming perfect competition, well, the market will by itself reach Pareto efficient equilibrium.
Yeah.
So that's the first
welfare theorem. Yeah.
And that's of course also leans towards the intuition by Adam Smith.
Yeah.
So he had that intuition that the markets would work in everybody's interests, even if everybody pursued their own interest. And basically, the conditions necessary for that was proven by Arrow and Debreu. The second welfare theorem is also very interesting and has.
Before we get to that, I have a little bit of a love affair with the first welfare theorem I need to share, just a little bit. So later on, sometime down in the future, forward markets and all that, we'll get to talking about Thaler, who got the prize for notching, which is a theory I'm highly critical of, I might as well say. And one of them is because I don't simply think he understands the first welfare theorem. I think it's very hard, and we'll talk more about that in that episode, but let's teach for it now. It's very hard to do notching without violating the welfare theorem. It's like, this is, and I think that for that reason, you should be skeptical of that theory, but we'll get to that later on. Anyway, the second welfare theorem, sorry to interrupt you, Otto.
Yeah, that really is interesting too, and has led to a lot of disagreements, and perhaps it's not always as well understood as the first one. It simply says that you can reach any equilibrium, Pareto efficient equilibrium. You can reach that as a market equilibrium simply by changing the initial wealth or initial resource distribution between all the agents. So
that sounds easy.
That sounds like actually that sounds like perhaps the dream of John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, exactly.
who had the idea that you could separate efficiency in production and distribution. So what it basically says is that we could change the distribution in the economy without violating efficiency. And very often, that's a basic trade-off that you have. If you want to change the distribution, there is a cost in terms of efficiency. But here you have the option, presumably, to just to decide what is the initial resource distribution going to be, and then you can reach not a perfect. For instance, you can't reach any equilibrium. For instance, it's highly unlikely that you find an equilibrium where everybody has the same income or the same utility. But among all the efficient ones, you could pick the one you prefer.
Yeah.
So, and of course, this would be true under the the assumption of general equilibrium, where you basically assume that the economy is taking place as a one-round affair.
Yes.
So we distribute the resources, the initial resources, then we trade, and then we reach the equilibrium. But in what we are having in the real world, of course, is not one equilibrium, but a number of equilibriums.
Yeah.
General equilibria moving as we move forward in time.
Yeah.
And that if you then in that case you can't just redistribute the initial resources, because the initial resources will be, or the final resources from one round will be the initial resources in another round, and then you would end up violating efficiency if you redistribute, or at least you could redistribute for just once, and then go forward from there. But so
that's what Piketty want to do, I guess.
Maybe Karl Marx as well, in a strange way, unless except that he wouldn't use markets, but the idea that he would nationalize all capital and use that as a base for distribution is sort of in line with this idea.
I actually think this is one of the reasons why Arrow turns away from socialism, is that he realized markets never disappear. Like, there will always be a market. It's just incentives can be really wrong and these kind of things, but there will always be some kind of market mechanism that will create some kind of equilibrium, given the institutional constraints, resource constraints, distribution, so on. Before we move on to some of the next stars, we do have to mention this as well. He has an impossibility theorem, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Which you call a possibility theorem, right?
That's what he calls it.
Yeah, I try to research that, but yeah.
I think we are actually going to discuss it later on. But what he basically proved was that any collective decision-making mechanism, or such as an election or government, or if you had an economist trying to maximize a social welfare function, that any system, any welfare function, or any mechanism for decision making could not simultaneously have 5 quite innocent properties at the same time. So that basically is saying you have to change. You have to. There's a choice between that the social choice is going to be arbitrary or determined by a dictator.
Yeah. Not a nice conclusion, many people will think. But
that if you're socialist, it's certainly not a nice.
It's not a nice conclusion. All right, let's move on a little bit to the next star of our show. So the next star of today is Joseph Stigler, who was born January 17, 1911, and died December 1st, 1991. He was also an American. He got the prize in 1982, and he is considered one of the key leaders of the Chicago School of Economics, especially the second generation. And he got it, and I quote, for his seminal studies of industrial structures, functioning of markets, and causes and efforts of public regulation. That is an impressive motivation. He was born in Seattle, Washington, of German descent, a little bit Hungarian as well. He spoke German in his childhood, graduated from University of Washington in 1931, and then had a short stint where he got an MBA at Northwestern, and there he discovered economics. So he got a scholarship to the University of Chicago, where he enrolled in 1933 and got a PhD in 1938. He taught at Iowa State, and at Columbia for most of World War II. He also actually worked on the Manhattan Project, doing math and statistics. So so that's interesting. He spent 1 year at Brown, back to Columbia, and then spent most of his time, but of course also spent a lot of time in Chicago. He was one of the only 4 people who actually managed to get a PhD under Frank Knight. Frank Knight was apparently extremely critical, and his good friend Milton Friedman says for this alone, Stigler is an impressive economist that he actually managed this. And besides Friedman, he was also influenced by, and Knight, of course, he was also influenced by Jacob Werner and Harry Simmons and Alan Wallace. So these are all like key Chicago figures. People will know if you know about this. My personal theory as to why he actually managed to get a PhD under Knight is because he was known for having a lot of humor. He wrote a lot of humorous texts as well, and Knight had a lot of humor too. Like if you read Knight's essays, and people who remember, he was a quite funny person, dry wit, and sort of like you, Otto, actually. So an example of the humor of Stigler is that he wrote one of the essays he's written is called A Sketch on the Truth in Teaching, where he described consequences of a fictional court decision where universities are held legally responsible for the consequence of their teaching errors. Which I would love, actually. I would love that. Like, I don't mind, but I think that's good. He's also, another example is from his Nobel lecture. I have this one quote here where he says, these economists are not suppliers of new ideas, but only demanders. Their problems is comparable to that of automobile buyers. To find a reliable vehicle, indeed, they usually end up by buying a used and therefore tested idea. So there is a lot of humor in him. He wrote a lot on a lot of topics, including the history of economics and history of thoughts, and those were actually also published in leading journals. He was a founding member of the Mount Pelerin Society and its president for 2 years, a very hardcore libertarian classical liberal. He was also involved with the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Besides the Nobel Prize, he also got a national medal in science. And I'm going to mention one more thing, and then I'm going to read actually from his speech because I think it actually bears repeating. But one thing I want to mention, he was the first primary business school person to get the prize. So that's actually a bit of an innovation in the history of the prize that they expanded to business school. I might also show the growing prominence of business schools that started in the 80s and certainly continues today. So anyway, I want to read from his banquet speech, so because I think it does bear repeating. Have you read it?
No, I don't think so.
No. So here it goes. It's almost its entirety, but it's not very long. So, even upon such a joyous occasion as this, an economist is entitled to feel sorry for himself. Unlike members of the physical and biological sciences, the economist is asked to explain his work in a manner that is interesting and convincing to a wary listener. Yet, there is no reason to believe that the explanation of our economic and social world is inherently simpler than the explanation of our physical world. The delicate and intricate pattern of competition and cooperation in the economic behavior of hundreds of thousands of citizens of Stockholm offers a challenge to the economist that is perhaps as complex as the challenges of the physicist and the chemist. Again, we economists are held responsible for the failures of economic policy. Each surge of inflation, each wave of unemployment is laid at our door. The physicist is not blamed when a meteor hits the Earth. The chemist is not held responsible for the misuse of poisons. And the medical sciences do not apologize for the common cold. Why then are economists blamed for the misdeeds of governments and ultimately the misdeeds of voters? We have no power over parliaments than our fellow scientists have over meteors and poisons and common colds. And yet, I would not freely exchange my science for those of my fellow laureates. They are forever confined in their professional discussions to a small numbers of their fellow citizens. A Swedish physicist cannot discuss his work with 50 people unless he goes abroad. A Swedish economist can get opinions and instructions in his native language from thousands upon thousands of his fellow citizens. Nor will these discussions be about narrowly specified subjects. No, they will be concerned with the policies that may eliminate poverty, indeed with the conditions for national survival and prosperity. This is a very, very funny man. I love him. I love him. So why did you think he was deserving of the prize?
So, and maybe we should, if I could just advertise his memoirs.
Yeah.
It's called The Memoirs of an Unregulated Economist. I think it's the most brilliant and funny and easily read memoirs of any economist, and actually really does a great job of explaining his ideas as well.
Cool.
So
we'll put it in the show notes.
So yes, you should definitely read those if you get the chance. Stigler and the Chicago School in general were somewhat skeptical towards general equilibrium theory, and were more focused on what they called price theory, or what partial equilibrium theory, where you basically use economic tools to understand how a specific market is working, or how a specific agent is working. How do phenomena arise out of the choices that a specific agent is making. So whereas general equilibrium is looking at the sort of what characterized the equilibrium for the entire market, they would much more look at a single market and try to understand that.
So bottom up versus top down, you would say.
Yeah, yes,
to a degree.
Yes. I think that's very, very, very well put. And if we could mention another Chicago economist, we're going to talk about him later as well. Gary Becker.
Yeah, in the next episode.
He took price theory and tried to apply it on non-economic problems.
Oh, yeah.
So he tried to explain the economics of crime, of addiction, of how the family works, using basic economic theory, and that's really price theory at work. That was what Stigler did as well, and tried to understand a lot of different types of markets, and generally agreeing with general equilibrium economists about the assumption of rationality and information, but looking at markets that were not perfect as well. In his work, he was he called his memoirs an unregulated economist, because he was also interested in the regulation of markets, and grew increasingly skeptical that regulation of markets really worked if you look at the incentives of the regulators. The idea, for instance, of capture, that somebody who is going to be regulated can capture the regulator, is coming from Stigler. So he was, in his own way, he was a contributor to what we call public choice theory, and have presenting in this series.
So just if I can add a little bit to that for our listeners, this is a really important insight. It might be common knowledge today. Well, maybe not, unfortunately, but the idea is that business people do not necessarily favor free markets. They might actually use their profit in order to gain an underserved protected monopoly, or capture, as Stigler called it. So one example of this could be if you own a company that produces addictive products, let's say smoke products, you might actually be in favor of banning cigarettes, Now, why would you be that? Because as part of that, you already have people addicted to nicotine. So if you can put in rules where it's really hard to produce the new type of nicotine products, you will be de facto like blocking off new competitions and be stuck with those 15% or whatever of people who are smokers and nicotine addicted forever, right? And that would be, it would make you look good. You'll signal that you're responsible, you're fighting cigarettes, but in fact, you're just creating a monopoly of addictors here. And these are the type of mechanisms that he shows quite well, and as one of the early pioneers of showing what we might call crony capitalism today.
And the importance of markets.
Exactly.
Has been a constant feature of the Chicago School is that you should look at the markets and how markets work if you want to know how well they function. There is an interesting thing about Stigler. In one area, he really held a general equilibrium position.
Oh, do tell.
In that he was very skeptical about changing policy or influencing policy, because his idea was that the equilibrium we are in, not only in economics but in politics as well, is reflecting that everybody is among the actions open to them, given their resources and other constraints. They choose the strategy that works out best for them. That might not mean that the collective result is best, but policy is not a result of error in that view, but is a result of, for instance, politicians, regulators, others simply maximizing their utility. So he was very skeptical about influencing politicians. Not just that he was skeptical about you couldn't tell a monopolist in the marketplace you should set prices lower because of the general welfare. The monopolist would say, well, that might be the case, but I maximize my profits by setting a higher price than the perfect competition price. So that would be in vain to try to convince him. But why should it be any different with the politicians?
Oh, yeah.
They are also might have gained utility from doing something which is contrary to general welfare. So he was very skeptical against this and had a constant discussion with Milton Friedman about whether you should try to influence policies or not. And I think that some of the skepticism towards policy comes from Frank Knight, who is extremely skeptical about economists going into trying to influence policy. And
well, Frank Knight was also just generally skeptical of politics, I think. Like I think this is actually very important. So many people think that the Chicago School of Economics is a very tight-knit sort of set of ideas. It's definitely not. And this is one of the big points of concessions. We wouldn't probably normally call Hayek a Chicago School economist, but he was at Chicago for large parts of his career. And he, for instance, argued that, the changes are just basically spontaneously happening anyway, right? So, we shouldn't waste time. Then you have Friedman, as you're saying, going actively out, trying to influence public opinion and politicians. And then a guy like Stigler. And another position, for instance, they also discussed was, was change necessarily better, even if it was a bad situation? Friedman famously would argue that you should vote for the person least likely to get a majority, because even though it's bad now, at least you know what it is, right? So there's a lot of skeptical for various points of position of politics, voters, and so on. And so I think that's important, and I think that's an important history of idea point to take away, that the Chicago School, all three of them, or potentially four, how many more, however you want to count it, is not a tight-knit, it's not like a political movement in that sense. These are all independent thinkers that are definitely challenging each other on key points.
I think, and you're absolutely right, there are great differences among different Chicago economists.
Yeah.
Frank Knight was very skeptical about empirical economics.
Yeah. Thereby proving that water flows downward.
So generally mistrustful about that you could prove anything by the empirical method, whereas Stigler actually introduced when he was an economics editor, it was demand that you should, if you put forward a theory, you should be able to falsify it, or you should and you should put forward some empirical proof or some empirical observations that would support your theory. So that was something he introduced as a journal editor, and that was quite opposite to Frank Knight.
Yeah. So to get a little bit back to the laureates of today here, so you mentioned, for instance, that him and Arrow disagreed sort of on, but also shared ideas about rationality. I think just to touch on that for our listeners here is, so as I understand Stigler, and please challenge me here if you don't, he's basically here doing the same as Friedman, saying we'll use as-if rationality, right? But we don't actually believe these to be true. Whereas I think Arrow saw it more as either a truism or a normative ideal or something like that. I think there is actually an acceptance of the fact that these are assumptions, but in the big picture, in the aggregate, they sort of hold up, right? So there's a methodological difference as well between Arrow and Stigler in their view of rationality, I think.
Yeah, I think it's some of the Chicago School, especially Milton Friedman, thought a lot about this question.
Yeah,
what if rationality, if as we observe it, is not the way we use it in our theory?
Yeah.
And what Friedman did was, and I think influenced a lot of other Chicago economists and economists in general, was the idea that you could use simplifying assumption would be okay if it could explain a phenomena or predict.
Actually, predict. It's predict that he wants to build models that have predictive power, right?
Exactly. So if I used an assumption which was not literally true, but could predict something, then it would be okay.
Yeah.
So Stigler used the assumption of perfect competition very often.
Yeah.
Not sort of believing that there was perfect competition everywhere, but saying that if it has predictive power, it is okay to do so.
So something like a full information assumption is, no individual has full information. The joint group of individual probably doesn't either, but a large group of individuals act sort of as if they have. Like there will at least be a lot of information collected here, guiding choices. So
I think it's if we try to contrast general and equilibrium theory and price theory, the methods, maybe we should look at what they're good at and what they're not good at.
Yeah. Let's do that.
And I could perhaps find an example where using a general equilibrium framework has improved a theory, because in some cases it is important to realize what happens in other markets if you do something in one market. And one of the places where that's certainly the case is if you apply taxation.
Yes.
Originally, the theory of taxation was developed from a partial equilibrium perspective. There was a famous Ramsey rule of taxation saying that the more a tax base would react to a tax, the lower should the tax rate be. So that should be the inverse elasticity. If we use technical terms, determine how high tax rates should be. If you could find something where people wouldn't react to the tax, then that would be the preferred tax objective. But if you realize that taxes intervene or have effects in other markets, that the rules could change. And one of the founding economists here we could mention is the British economist Millis,
who we're going to talk a little bit more about in the next episode.
Yeah, we have a bio of it, but he improved on the theory of taxation by looking at it in a general equilibrium perspective.
Yeah.
So realizing that taxes, if you tax in one market, it would have an effect in other markets. And basically, today we would often say that the best tax base is really taxing wages.
Yeah.
So you should tax wages, not capital, and that's because all taxes in effect has an influence on the labor supply.
Yeah.
So it's better rather than taxing wages or labor indirectly. For instance, by taxing capital. you should tax it directly.
Yeah.
So that would leave less distortions in the economy, and there are some important results from Atkinson and Stigler's stating the conditions where you should basically only tax labor in an economy where there is no if we disregard externalities, if there are externalities, they should be taxed. But if there are no externalities, you should only tax labor, and you should do so even if your only concern is redistribution. Now that was interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
So you shouldn't tax capital even if you want to have to even income as much as possible. Of course, the basic point in Millis' theory is that you should. His theory is a trade-off between redistribution and efficiency, and you should try to minimize the welfare cost of redistributing income.
Yeah. I just like to add a little thing here before we move on. Then we also have to finish up this episode, of course, with our last star. But so I think some of these insights about how to do taxations ought to be laminated and given out to all new politicians of parliament, because they mess this up all the time. And one of the biggest joys about working with you, Otto, is when you point out these basic errors for a politician. I remember a while back you were in a debate around energy inflation. And of course, all the politicians want to score some populist point with helping people with their energy bills. And in Denmark, we have a very high general VAT tax. And one party suggested that we should just, give away VAT on energy, so gas and you just very briefly explain, well, it's high, it's general, it's the same as basically an income tax in this sense. So if you do that, you're just giving a subsidy to use energy, and it will have no effect on the prices. And I just absolutely loved it. Well, it have an effect on the prices because it will push the prices up. It will change behavior. I just absolutely love that pure, logical use of pure economics in a policy setting, and you totally own that, politicians. No names mentioned, but I remember that debate quite well.
but maybe Stigler would tell me that maybe the politician wasn't making an error. Maybe he was simply proposing the policy that would be most to his interest, even if it wasn't to the interest of the general welfare.
Oh yeah, exactly. And just to finish off Stigler, one thing that he also adds to the topics of the day, and I think we already talked about it, so we need to talk not a lot, but that is just the economics of information, because that also becomes extremely important in understanding how equilibria forms, basically, right? So we always talk a little bit about it, but we have to give him credit for actually being one of the first people to truly highlight that that part of it.
And very glad you mentioned it, because it is a very important point in Millis' theory about optimal taxation.
Oh yeah,
to realize that authorities have a limited number of information available.
Yeah.
Because if the tax authority has all information available, they would know the tax the ability of each person, and they could just write out the personal tax to everybody, and they would have to pay that no matter what. That wouldn't influence their behavior. But the problem is that the tax authorities, they don't know how much ability everybody has, and if you're taxing the product of their ability, they might try to hide their ability by producing less. So that's where the trade-off between equity and efficiency comes in a very brilliant way in Millis.
Yeah, I love in this episode how, and I hope our listeners is enjoying that too, how a lot of the theories brings a lot of partial building blocks of economic theory together, and this is exactly an example of that. So let's just quickly round off with the last star of today, Gérard Debreu. He was a French economist and mathematician. He was born on July 4th, 1921, died on December 31st, 2004. He has been a professor at University of California in Berkeley, but of course also at the University of Paris. He won the 1983 Nobel Prize, and the motivation was for having incorporated new analytical methods into economic theory and for his rigorous reformulation of the theory of general equilibrium. So it's a little bit about method we need to talk about him in. But just briefly, a bit of background on him. He was an early orphan. He studied math in France, but the day he was supposed to take the exam, it was D-Day happened. So he joined the French army and fought for freedom for a while. So that's good. But he did eventually get a PhD from the University of Paris. He also, besides Berkeley, he also taught at Yale and Chicago. He was married, had 2 daughters, and he worked on a lot of the same issues and with Arrow. Now, I made a little bit of a mistake. I didn't have full information, maybe, or at least I forgot my information. That's also part of information. You can forget your information. You have limited cognitive abilities. Because when I mentioned Arrow's speech, that wasn't actually the right thing I said there. So Arrow's speech is actually a great mixture of math, reality, and history of thought, right? Whereas if we actually then compare that to Debreu, who was very influenced by Valras, actually, who we also talked about today, it is a pure history of mathematical economics. But it's a great lecture as well, if you're interested in that. So just very briefly, because we are really running out of time, what should we take away from our dear Frenchman here?
Well, I think we have talked about general equilibrium and then the development of it and this new way of proving something that nobody was able to prove before. And we talked about Arrow to begin with, because he was the first of the 2 to get the Nobel Prize. But actually, they developed the proof of the existence of general equilibrium simultaneously. Not that they didn't know the others worked on it. So basically, they worked on the same issues. And we're talking about general equilibrium. Arrow and Debreu are very much in tandem. Even if they didn't to begin with work with one another, they did the foundational work. Then of course they also did other things, and especially Arrow made a lot of contributions, impressive number of contributions to economic theory. And
so now math is not easy to do in podcasts, so we're not doing a lot of that in this podcast. But just to be a little bit technical about it, what they do, in particular Debreu, is that they prove the existence of general equilibrium using topological rather than calculus-based methods. If you want to be really nerdy about it here, and again,
points.
Exactly. So this is how. Yeah, exactly. Perfect. I think that's it for today. Would you agree? Perfect. Thank you so much for your time, Otto, and thank you, dear listeners, for listening in on our review of these 3 great economists. And until next time, stay rational. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us exploring the history of economic thought. You're very welcome to email comments and suggestions to stefan@cepas.dk. Please like and share and recommend this podcast anywhere you can and think it's relevant. Until next time, stay rational.